I'm Greg Robinson. I'm professor of history at L'Université du Québec à Montréal, University of Quebec at Montreal for the French challenged. It's a French language institution in Montreal, Canada, but I'm originally from New York, and I wanted to talk about my book, By Order of the President, FDR and the Internment of Japanese Americans. The way that I came to write the book and what informs the book is that I was at the Franklin Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park in the summer of 1996, researching something completely different. And I was waiting for my boxes to be brought to me. If you've ever been to an archive, it's a lot of what you do when you're at an archive is wait for things to be brought to you. They're pretty fast, but anyway, being a rather restless and fidgety person, I puttered around the research room while I was waiting for my boxes, and I came across a finding aid for writings by Franklin Roosevelt, particularly from before he was president. And I thought, wow, I never thought of him as much of a writer. I wondered what his ideas were and how they had influenced his later life. Just then my boxes came and I put the idea out of my mind. But some months later, after I'd quit school, I was invited to write an article about Franklin Roosevelt by a journal. And I thought, well, why don't I do something about those writings? I'd never heard of his writings from before he was president. And so I ordered them up. I figured I would write on his writings from before he was president, how they anticipated his policies under the New Deal when he was president. During the 1920s, Roosevelt had polio, and he spent most of his time trying to get his legs to work again. And he founded Warm Springs as a treatment center and such. So I knew that he'd been out of public life, and he apparently wrote different things to have something to do with himself and to keep his name in the public eye. But I discovered that he had written several things about Japanese-American relations. He wanted to improve American relations with Japan. He thought the Japanese could be trusted. So he wrote a set of articles where he said that the big problem between Japan and the United States is Japanese immigrants to the United States. They stick out. They are unassimilable. They can't be made into Americans. And so the danger is that they will settle in America. And he said that the laws that prevented Japanese and other Asians from coming to America or from becoming citizens or owning land were that they protected the racial purity of white Americans against interracial marriage. And that really shocked me. I thought, if that's what he thought in the 1920s, what did he think in the 1940s? I knew that Franklin Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 9066, which had enabled the government to put Japanese Americans out of their homes and eventually into a set of camps. But what did Roosevelt have to do with that? And in the process of trying to answer that question, I discovered that people who had written about Roosevelt hadn't written about Japanese Americans, and people who had written about Japanese Americans hadn't written about Roosevelt. There was a big hole in the historical literature. And in the process of trying to answer the question, which went from a paper to a dissertation to a book to a career, I discovered just how much Japanese Americans have and other Asian Americans have influenced American life and law and culture. So with Roosevelt, the importance is that he thought that Asians were unassimilable. That is, they had their biological characteristics which made them fine for their Japanese environment, but they couldn't come over to the United States and in one generation or two generations or three generations or four generations become real Americans. They would always stick out, they would always be different, and they would always cause conflict with other Americans. And worse, if they intermarried with white Americans, the result would be people who didn't have a stable set of biological characteristics who would be all scrambled, and the worst possible case in 9 times out of 10, as Roosevelt said. So when Pearl Harbor came and there was pressure from the West Coast states, particularly from white congressmen who had a political advantage in supporting their white constituents against their Asian constituents who weren't allowed to vote, from the West Coast military and from his advisors, Roosevelt decided that the citizenship rights of 100,000 people whom he somehow didn't consider as real Americans anyway, in some essential but unclear sense, were just not as important as the needs of the war. So he agreed to sign an executive order which would give the War Department, and by delegation the West Coast Defense Command, the capacity to deal with the problem. And what they chose was to remove all Japanese Americans from the West Coast and eventually to put them in a set of government built and operated camps, in most cases for the duration of the war.